Hello, everyone. We're just seeing people come in, so give us a few more minutes and we will begin our session. Welcome. For those of you that are just coming in, welcome. Just give us a few more minutes. We have quite a number of people that have signed up for this session, and we're just going to wait a little bit to get as many people in the room as possible, and we will start. All right, so let's begin. So welcome to the Online Ethics Center Spring 2024 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. My name is Azita Hirsa, and I'm a teaching professor at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's School of Engineering, Industrial Systems Engineering Department, where I teach courses in Management of Engineering and Technology, Ethics of Modeling, Engineering Ethics and Professional Development, Technological Issues and Solutions. I'm the chair of the Ethics Division at the American Society of Engineering Education and thrilled to be the webinar host for the OEC's 2023-24 season. The Online Ethics Center, hosted at the University of Virginia, is a digital repository for resources on teaching and learning about ethics in engineering and science. The OEC also fosters a community of faculty, students, researchers, and other professionals who come together to discuss ethics. Please check out our website at onlineethics.org. The theme of our fall-spring webinar series is Engineering Ethics in Industry. I'm delighted to host our speaker today, Carla Childers, head of the Bioethics-based Science and Technology Policy, Office of the Chief Medical Officer at Johnson & Johnson. Carla Childers joined Johnson & Johnson in October 2013 in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, where her primary responsibility has been leading and coordinating various ethics-based science and technology policy projects. Ms. Childers is the chair of the J&J Bioethics Committee, which serves as an internal forum providing advice on bioethical questions within J&J. She serves as a bioethics subject matter expert for various internal and external science and technology policy work and coordinates the internal bioethics educational program sponsored by the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. Ms. Childers is actively engaged outside of J&J in various R&D and ethics-based work. She co-founded the Drug Information Association, DIA, bioethics community, and recently joined the board of directors of FASPE Fellowship at Auschwitz for the study of professional ethics. She also serves as a teaching assistant and a lecturer in the Columbia University Master of Bioethics program. Before joining J&J, she managed cross-functional drug development teams in various therapeutic areas and stages of development for Merck Research Labs. Prior to that, Ms. Childers began her career in industry as a bench chemist in MRL's process chemistry group. Welcome to our session today. After Ms. Childers' talk, we will take questions. To ask questions, please type in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I will read your questions to her. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. So Carla, thank you so much for being here, and I will pass the mic on to you.
Great, Azita, thank you so much. And let me just say what a privilege it is to be talking to this audience. You heard in my bio that I'm a chemist, and so I'm a big fan of science and technology. So this is really a lot of fun for me to do today. So thank you so much. The title is called Navigating the Gray Space, and I think you'll kind of get the sense for why I've called it that. And I'll talk about the bioethics in the pharmaceutical industry, but we'll also make some connections in technology and innovation, more generally speaking. I like to include the disclosures. You probably already heard them in my bio, but I like to put them here and indicate that this is me coming to talk with all of you. And while I'm affiliated with these organizations, I may at sometimes express opinions that aren't reflective of their position. But this is how I keep myself busy here. So what we're going to cover today, as I was talking with Azita about this, I thought it might be useful before I dive into what does bioethics look like in practice to really give a little bit of a history and an overview of bioethics. It's actually a reasonably new field if you think about it, and we'll go into some more detail why I say that. And it's interesting to see the connections between the practice of it and then how things have been codified into law and thinking about those. I then will give you a little bit of some insight into what it looks like in my day job and what bioethics looks like in practice in the pharmaceutical industry. And then I have hopefully what is a fun but cautionary tale of unintended consequences that can be instructive as we think about and as you all think about innovating, developing new things, discovering new things, and some of those tough questions you may want to think about asking yourself as you're doing those things. And we'll of course leave time for Q&A and really look forward to hearing what questions you all have. So, and I guess we have the chat function. So for this, you can use the chat function if you want. I'm curious, when you saw in this particular series, you saw bioethics, what do you think of when you hear the word bioethics? And if you can't drop it into the webinar chat, that's okay. Think to yourself quietly for a moment if you can't type into it. Okay. And I think we have that function disabled, so that's okay. So hopefully, as you were thinking about that, you were coming up with some ideas about what bioethics means and how it may be even different from ethics. And so just taking a step back, ethics, generally speaking, we're talking about what is good and bad, what is moral duty and obligation, what kind of moral principles are we using to make decisions about situations that are unclear, or as we think about what's going to govern a group or an individual or a group. So ethics at its threshold is thinking about these types of things. When we move into bioethics more specifically, this is a branch of applied ethics, and we'll talk about that. And you're looking at the philosophical, social, ethical, legal issues that arise in medicine, the life sciences. In the biopharmaceutical industry, the medical technology industry, this is largely showing up as research ethics, and we'll talk about that predominantly. But it also looks at clinical ethics. How do physicians, what are the moral obligations for them? How do we think about the duties in public health space? How do we think about allocating scarce resources? We saw this a lot in the pandemic. Organ transplantation ethics, reproductive ethics, recently in the news with the Alabama ruling around IVF, or treatment of embryos. So it can span a lot of different areas. We'll focus more heavily on research ethics today, but we'll also get into some other discussions that touch these particular areas. And often what we find is that complex topics like things like what do you do with a frozen embryo cuts across a range of different disciplines, and it can be applied bioethics across these domains. And I'll just give this to you as my business case for why I think it's important in innovative product development. And usually when you're thinking of pharmaceutical products or medical devices, the things in the gray box are where people think of often bioethics coming up. They think about benefit risk. Are the benefits balanced and proportional to the risk? They think of conflicts of interest, maybe informed consent, transparency of activities. Frequently, questions around medication access come up in vulnerable populations. But interestingly, it's also these questions around scientifically valid research. You shouldn't be doing an experiment that is not going to yield appropriate results and put human participants at risk if it's not well-founded and it's not structured properly. Being good stewards of finite resources is an important part of it. And these other things that you can see here, including emerging technologies and supply interruptions, and equitable inclusion. So it really cuts across a range of areas in the entire product development life cycle as we think about it. So what I'm going to do to start is give you a little bit of a bioethics and a research ethics roadmap to give you a sense also of the fact that this hasn't been around that long. And now, obviously, the first thing I'm going to show you now is a slide that goes back to the Hippocratic Oath, but we'll talk about that in context of these other activities. But this is just a little bit of a timeline as you think about bioethics and research ethics. And I just like to point it out because it's been less than, fewer than 100 years that we've really had conceptions around what does appropriate research with humans look like and what should the principles be. And it took us a while actually to get to the point where we codified those into something that had teeth and had actual requirements. So we'll do a little bit of a history tour before we dive into some of the practical aspects. So the Hippocratic Oath, which many people are familiar with, that physicians often take these oaths, and it's been around since the 5th century BC. So this was mainly targeting clinicians, for lack of a better word, individuals who were caring for the sick at the time. So even back then, as long ago as that, we had conceptions around this special relationship between a physician and a patient. You can see already concepts around helping those who are sick, concepts around harm and injustice and preventing that. I think the middle one is super interesting, that even back then, way before HIPAA, GDPR, and modern day conceptions of legal privacy, you had this concept of confidentiality and privacy, because these caregivers were going into people's homes. They were seeing what their personal lives were like. And even then, this notion that relationship was sacrosanct, that you needed a patient to feel comfortable that their things that they might be embarrassed about were going to be kept confidential so they could be honest with that caregiver. And here's just a little bit of trivia for you. Oftentimes people think of above all, do no harm in the Hippocratic Oath, and it was actually in a later Hippocratic document. So you can impress your friends this weekend with that little bit of trivia. So fast forward many centuries, and it wasn't really until after World War II, during which we became aware of really horrific experiments conducted by physicians, that we started to have this conversation around what did appropriate research ethics principles look like. And it was arising out of the Nuremberg trial post-World War II, where the experiments committed by the Nazi doctors on the prisoners in the concentration camps, it wasn't until that really crystallized this importance to articulate what are the principles that we should be, especially physicians, should be thinking about as we conduct human research. And this is a bit of an eye chart, and I'll share these slides afterwards, but these were the 10 principles and directives that came out of that. And what's interesting is, so this is 1947, and I want you to remember that from a timing perspective. So think about that timing. You'll see that there are various aspects that are familiar to us. You must have voluntary consent. You must have a productive reason for doing the experiment. You should have a good scientific basis. In this case, it highlights animal experimentation to support it, but you should have a good basis for the experiment. You're trying to avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. The person, voluntariness showed up in a couple of places, and that the individual should always be able to stop, which obviously wasn't the case during those experiments during World War II in the concentration camps. Talks about risk. So this document set up critically important concepts for the conduct of research with human experimentation, but it was still a guideline. It was not a law. It wasn't globally enforceable or even enforceable in a particular region, but they were principles that were articulated. So coming out of that, there was a very interesting conflict for physicians as they thought about these individuals who had taken the Hippocratic Oath, promised to protect patients, conducted these types of experiments with patients. And so globally, the World Medical Association got together and assembled to think about then, how do they as physicians, so how should they be thinking about research in light of the Nuremberg Code, in light of what we learned about what happened in the concentration camps. And this was intended to help physicians balance that difficult tension of being a physician obligated to individual care and yet conducting clinical research that's not intended to treat someone, but intended to answer an experimental question and generally create generalizable knowledge. And it was interesting at the time, because if you looked at the history of this, there was this real contemplation of saying, well, they were monsters, those Nazi doctors. We couldn't possibly ever do anything that bad. This is our guidelines, but we're different from them, and we're not doing these things. And yet there was a real tension at the time, knowing some physicians were probably stepping over some lines, making some assumptions about what patients needed to know and understand. And this was perhaps most unfortunately illustrated in the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee. And you'll see there that I note it's from the 1930s all the way till 72. And I give you the full name of the study to emphasize that this was a study conducted by the U.S. government. So this wasn't some fly-by-night sort of closet researcher not doing anything in the light of day. This was a very public study that was conducted. Some people like to argue that perhaps the protocol could have been ethical, because at the time that the study was started, the treatments for syphilis were basically heavy metals. So think of giving somebody lead and other types of really basically poisonous, toxic heavy metals to try to treat syphilis, because we didn't have antibiotics at the time. So some people say, well, observing the natural course of syphilis could have been useful because we didn't really know as much about it. And perhaps that might have been able to be true if they hadn't targeted a very vulnerable, illiterate, poor Black community in Alabama. So they definitely chose people who wouldn't be able to ask a lot of questions, who wouldn't be able to understand what was happening. They were just told they had bad blood. And so even with that, there are a lot of questions about the ethics of even starting the study. But in particular, after World War II, with the discovery of penicillins and the ability to mass produce penicillin, this study should have ended immediately, and anybody should have been treated. Instead, it went on for another 32 years until it was actually broken as a news story that this was happening. And during the course of the time the study was being conducted, there were publications, there were public discussions about this. So this was not a secret in the academic and medical community that this study was happening. So once this became public, finally, in the early 70s, the National Research Act was passed. And it did many things, one of which, as you can see, it created an actual a department within the US government for protection of human research subjects. This is when we first start articulating the requirements for institutional review boards to have independent oversight of research, reinforce the voluntary consent, and talked about what consent actually means, meaning that people need to be fully informed, which clearly the individuals in the Public Health Service study were not. And the commission was tasked with then articulating the basic ethical principles more broadly. So here are some guidelines for it. What are the actual principles we should apply and be thinking about as we make decisions in the conduct of research? And they issued the Belmont Report, which is a seminal document in the study, as I noted in the original overview, of bioethics and research ethics. And they described 3 critical principles that should be applied. And this was eventually codified into US Code of Federal Regulations. And I do a lot of teaching to individuals who are often in regulatory roles or roles about enforcing the law. And I always like to remind them that the basis of the law and the original intent of the law was to protect these principles and to not get them disconnected and just think about the signature on a consent form as being what's important. It's actually the process of getting there. The common rule is what you'll hear commonly discussed about it. And this is the in the US CFR, This is focused on government-funded research in the US. So basically all US academic institutions and pretty much everyone follows the common rule because they also usually have government-funded research. The Food and Drug Administration isn't necessarily considered a common rule agency, but the FDA is required to harmonize with it. So pharmaceutical industry, med tech industry, when we're conducting research, for the advancement and the development and approval of drugs and devices are following similar, if not the same types of rules for drug development. So briefly, the three principles, and I'm actually going to give you a bit more of an expanded version of my preferred analysis that's sort of an adjunct to the Belmont report. They articulated three principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And usually respect for persons and treating people as autonomous agents, and offering protection with those with diminished decision-making ability. That's usually connected to informed consent and thinking about that voluntariness. What's that relevant information? Beneficence is a balancing of harms and benefits. We'll talk in a moment, as I allude to there, about Beecham and Childress, who actually broke this apart. And I'll explain why I think the way they discuss it is a bit more comprehensive. But it's talking about those risks and benefits. And then justice is focused on distributing both the benefits and the burdens fairly, so that you're not overly burdening one particular group or individual and not selectively benefiting. And this comes up a lot in concepts of equity and making sure that you're using good decisions to equitably share the benefits and not just cherry picking and selecting those people you like or that you want to have those benefits. And it also comes up under individual justice, social justice, and contemplations around those groups that might be unfairly burdened. So Beecham and Childress, interestingly, were part of the Belmont Report committee, but shortly thereafter, they chose to write the Principles of Biomedical Ethics, which is another seminal tome in the literature for research ethics and bioethics. And they chose to elaborate 4 principles. Autonomy looks very similar. They're still focused on that moral principle of respect for persons and the right of individuals to make their own choices about what happens to them. And this is why providing adequate information is so important, so that people really have context for what's going to happen so they can make that good choice. And it really does manifest mostly as informed consent. And they talked about the different aspects of informed consent that are critical and what standards should be used. The prudent person, what would a prudent person want to know to be able to make that decision? Not what the doctor thinks the patient should hear and what the doctor thinks, but what would a prudent person want to understand? And it was battling against some of that paternalism that we had seen through the earlier parts of the 20th century that were causing some researchers to make interesting decisions about what patients had a right to know about. And then again, special consideration for vulnerable populations. So this is where I think that their analysis was more sophisticated, in that they took beneficence and they broke it apart into beneficence and non-maleficence, a little bit of a mouthful. And the beneficence, they talked about a demand for a positive benefit. You must take action. This requires you to proactively act and affirmatively act to do the things that advance benefit for the patient's interest in the research participant. Non-maleficence, interestingly, can often be achieved by doing nothing. So if you avoid doing something, you're going to avoid doing harm. And that's an interesting tension, or an interesting way to separate the analysis. And this comes up a lot in the consultations that we have internally, is that we're often, beneficence isn't always that hard to think about. What's that demand for a positive benefit? But it is more important sometimes to think about, is what I'm doing going to cause harm? Could I prevent it actually by not even doing that thing? And additionally, I add the comment that especially in informed consent, because these can be met by doing nothing, it's something we often maybe don't emphasize to people and patients and participants enough, because a physician's obligation is to act, to affirmatively help someone. So they may not adequately describe what that patient's option would be if they don't do anything, because that's counterintuitive. So keeping these in mind and keeping that balance in mind, that it's not just always acting, there could be an option that needs to be discussed because it could be important. I've just found to be a really helpful tool to remember that. Justice looks very similar, talking about that fair distribution of goods and services, or medical goods and services, treating like versus like. So again, going to that equity of, if you have similarly situated individuals, how are you thinking about the benefits that should accrue to them similarly, not preferentially giving benefit to a certain group. And importantly, and this comes up a lot in industry, in companies, resources aren't limitless. There is not just an unlimited pot of money, time, people, resources, drugs, things. So trade-offs have to happen. And it's important to then think about the things of, like, who is likely to benefit, who's likely to be harmed by that choice. What is the urgency of the need? What potentially are the alternatives that someone has? Are you making a permanent change in the quality of life? Is it temporary? Is it easily to resolve? How long might they benefit? So there are really interesting questions that come up a lot in this space, and challenging yourself to use objective criteria, to think not just about maybe the one compelling case in front of you, but how might an entire population or others like that individual be affected, is a really important part of a lot of the ethical analyses that we do. And then the individual justice, that tension with the greater good and distributing benefit to a group versus, again, a very compelling individual interest in front of you. So that's a lot, right? So we have our laws, they cover a lot, but then there are questions that come up in this gray space, and or even if it's interpretation, or if it's things that are new that develop. So I want to shift gears a little bit and maybe now go into what this actually looks like in practice in my day job a bit, and in bioethics and industry in general. And the first thing I include is that organizational structure addresses a lot. So the pharmaceutical medtech industries, highly regulated, lots of rules to follow, lots of scrutiny, and that there's going to be internal structure that helps. So most companies have some kind of either mission statement or organizational ethos that they put forward. Johnson & Johnson has its credo that is very important, and my organizational ethics professor actually uses it to teach about a company articulating priorities publicly to help them make decisions and stay focused on what's important. So most companies have some type of statement of what is important to them and how they're doing that. That then gets fed into things like policy positions, what we call message maps or value statements, and taking positions on important societal questions, taking positions on medical and scientific issues. And there may be a desire to advance or influence these things, that being clear on what that company's position is across the organization is important to those operating within the organization. Not surprising, there is a host of policies and guidelines and what we would call control documents internally, standard operating procedures, business level policies, job aids. So again, in that highly regulated environment, the importance of having quality and audit functions, making sure people are following them. So I share this to say, institutionally in the industry, there's a lot of structure built in and built upon, I would argue, the foundation of bioethics that companies and their employees follow. And yet, I know from my day job, and we all know, that questions still arise and tough situations come up. I borrowed this a little bit from how we think about it, and I think it's pretty consistent, that as you think about navigating the gray space, you may start to put in some additional structure that supplements that written documentation. So you've got your control document, your policies and procedures. In some cases, you may take the additional step of creating committees that have different stakeholders on it who can be more responsible and accountable, and at a moment's notice, be able to be pulled together to define policy, react to questions, provide consistent oversight. And these are just some examples of committees that we actually have internally that are tasked with having oversight for some of these more critical and or sensitive areas. So the Bioethics Committee is convened to weigh in on topics that we've talked about, like research ethics. We have an Animal Welfare Council that addresses animal research and animal welfare. We have a committee that looks at innovative technologies and things coming up, like think about cell and gene therapy, stem cell use, genome editing, things that sort of fall in that advanced therapy space. We have a group dedicated to pediatrics research that we could talk about, and then access questions, multiple committees thinking about access questions. And again, the approach thinking, how do you make it risk-based and prioritizing the things most likely to come up and not duplicative of your other governance structures you have in place. And so this is just a snapshot of what my day job looks like. And the areas of focus that I have then are the bioethics consultations, the services that we provide, and internal education, as well as the third bullet, external thought leadership and education. I'm super lucky that J&J is very supportive of me doing things like what I'm doing today, which is sharing knowledge with others outside the company and outside of industry. I teach at Columbia, which I love, so I get to still stay connected to the academic world, serving on boards and other places. So there's this really important emphasis that bioethics just doesn't live in a vacuum inside, but it's important to go out, engage in these conversations, engage with stakeholders, and have conversations with others about bioethics in the industry. And then there's an aspect of my work that is policy development and an oversight. So actually articulating what the policies should be and then overseeing those committees that have accountability for those policies. So I just wanted to give you a brief, I have that, I'm going to get to the unintended consequences in just another couple of slides, but I wanted to highlight the Bioethics Committee because I'm super proud of the work the committee does. We serve as an internal forum. I have about 20 people who sit on the committee that have a range of expertise, and they don't do this as their day job. This is a voluntary thing they do and serve in the organization by sitting on the committee. And they are very passionate about championing the principles, providing advice, serving as subject matter experts. And so we get a lot of questions from teams across the organization that relate to things like research ethics. I have a novel question coming up about informed consent, and I'm not sure how we should think about it. We have had a lot of activity around the pandemic, around disruptions in Ukraine and from military conflict when we're conducting research in those areas. Climatic events that come up. So it's a terrific venue for coming together. And what it looks like is the vast majority of the intake comes in up front through me as the chair. So I have what we call curbside consultations, and I keep the bar really low. So somebody can email me, I'm not sure if it's an issue, can I talk to you? So that's probably a lot of what I'd say maybe 50 to 60% of my day job is meeting with people, talking through issues, issue spotting, and trying to figure out what they need for help. A lot of those things are addressed in that conversation. Some of them, excuse me, some of them are directed to small groups of subject matter experts. Some of them rise to the level of having the full committee consultation, where we have background materials and a thorough discussion. I have external advisors that I keep connected to in case I want to, particularly sticky things or issues where we may as an institution have blind spots that we really benefit from somebody outside reflecting back to us. And we do a lot of sharing of insights and best practices, both internally and externally. So it's a fairly robust model that we've created. And again, super proud of the committee and the work they've done. And it's been in existence. J&J has had a bioethics committee for nearly 20 years. And so that's also been a really wonderful support through time as we've learned. So I'm going to shift gears once again as we shift into the last bit before Q&A. And this, I think, is interesting for this particular group. And I want you to think about maybe the ethics principles and then think about the work that you're doing that's innovative as you make discoveries, as you think of new applications. And I want to tell you a story about somebody I learned about through my work at FASB, the organization that does ethical leadership training. So don't Google this. You're not allowed to Google. Without searching the internet, does anyone know what two inventions this man, Thomas Midgley, what he was, and I would probably say infamous for. So think to yourselves, you can tell me later in the Q&A if you got it right and you knew. He was an American mechanical and chemical engineer and an inventor. And he, obviously, you can see what period of time he was living in. So I'll give you another second, no Googling. And now I'll give you the suspense. So he's interestingly responsible for two of the most significant impacts on climate change and our environment. According to Bill Bryson, an environmental historian, these two experiments had more impact on the atmosphere than any other person to date. In the early parts of the 20th century, he was a very avid inventor, an academician, and his first thing was developing leaded fuel. At the time, they were having problems with something called engine knock and having problems with the functioning of the engines. And so he found that by adding lead, the combustion engines worked more effectively, but with the result that you're using tetraethyl lead and lead's being released into the atmosphere. And we all know now, and perhaps have the benefit of hindsight, that that is not a good thing. And interestingly, as I was doing some research for this, actually leaded fuel is still used in some cases like aviation, aeronautics, and some other cases. The other thing he was known for was solving the problem of refrigerants and developing chlorofluorocarbons for the use in refrigeration and cooling. Again, we now know that this depletes the ozone, and you can see this complex diagram there on the left that talks about how this happened. But this one person, and he was very eager. It wasn't that he did these things and was reticent about them. And it's interesting because I think this helps us understand how we as scientists and we as inventors, like, could he have done more experiments on lead to understand what the human impact would be? Was it foreseeable that he could think that all of this lead would go into the environment and people could be poisoned by it? What might he have wanted to know about the fluorinated, chlorinated carbon molecules before using them in a way that went into air? And so as a chemist, I'm challenged because I'm like, wow, what experiments did I not think about that maybe I should have? But he's an interesting cautionary tale about, as we do things, as we develop things, what are those questions we may want to ask ourselves about the potential implications? Why are we doing them? If any of you have seen the movie, and probably everybody has by this time, Oppenheimer, that movie does a really good job of showing that tension between, in that case, developing something, that excitement, that race for innovation, that race to figure it out first, sometimes with the intent to not have somebody else use it possibly for bad, but that in consequences that then happen. And as you become aware of those, I would just argue and submit that we as innovators, scientists, people who are creating things and creating new knowledge have perhaps a little bit of an added burden to say, what might the unintended consequences of my actions be? At this stage in our lives and in scientific innovation, we can't any longer say we don't have really the tools to try to figure this out. Maybe you could give some hand waving to Thomas Midgley. And then how this might play out in life sciences. I've got a little case study that we can go through, but I want to do one thing first. I want to go through these questions and I want to pause to see. So I'll pause right now to say, I'm going to shift into Q&A. So if you do have any questions you'd like to ask me, I'll be pausing after this slide to see if we get any questions coming in. And if we don't, I'll go back a slide to the case study and we can kind of talk about that. So that's your prompt to say if you've got a question. As Azita mentioned, put it in the Q&A so she can see that question and we can be aware of it. So I guess from my perspective, as we think about bioethics, as we think about obligations, and even just ethics generally and in scientific innovation, I think we have to be willing to ask ourselves tough questions, and challenging ourselves to think about the potential unintended consequences. It's not that you can possibly know everything that could ever happen by something you do, but you should be willing to reflect on, have I thought about the ways in which this thing could be misused, harm others, have these types of consequences? And thinking about the consequences and balanced by the potential benefit. I'm sure there are probably some things that we've just gone ahead and developed and thought about the potential benefit perhaps, and not really thought about, is there equity in who the benefits are accruing? Are there just financial benefits for a small few? Is it an innovation that's only going to be able to be available to a small number of people? And this comes up a lot in healthcare, of as you think about amazing new technology, therapies that are changing the way we treat some conditions, who's actually going to be able to have access to that? How are we going to make sure that if we have these innovations, there's going to be a pathway to those who might not be as financially well off to actually access them? An interesting one that comes up, that as you ask yourself, what's the true purpose of a project? What are the motivations behind it? And there's some really interesting stories from World War II of some really entrepreneurial engineers who were developing innovations for the concentration camps. And there's an interesting tension between looking at the goal of an engineer who builds something like a crematoria or an oven for a horrible purpose, and them focusing on the technical problem and not really thinking about the purpose without challenging themselves to think about what they're enabling. Now, that's an extreme example, and they're probably more likely questions of us on a daily basis of, why am I doing this? What are the reasons? Is this time well spent? Is this resources well spent? But it's important to think about that as we get caught up in some of these excitements about new technology, and just checking ourselves and asking some of those questions. And importantly, all of you have your own personal values, and you should think about how what you're doing is lining up with that. Are you, not that you have to have all the same values, but you as an individual don't just check your values and your morals at the door when you come into the office, or you come into your lab, or you come to school, and thinking about how what you're doing. And the last one is really interesting and this comes up even in my work. Am I being overly clever to serve a purpose that might be questionable, either morally or inappropriate? And this can be, am I trying to back into an answer because I know that's what the person who's asking me would like me to say? And so this is just one of those, again, kind of thinking about motivations. And when I talk about this, I talk about it like my personal moral dashboard of like, what are the things that need to be true for me to continue to feel confident in my work and my job, that what I'm doing is credible, consistent with my values, isn't covering up things that, and not, I'm not saying anything disparaging about the industry or my company, but it's just, how do I then show up as an individual in these situations? And especially with you all in innovation, and I think connecting the ethics to that and the personal morality is an important part of that. So I'm going to pause there, and I don't see, Azita, do you see any questions coming in?
I don't see any questions yet. I do have a question.
Oh, go ahead, please.
As an educator, as someone who is teaching ethics to young engineers that are going to go out into the world, that these questions are so awesome. But I wonder what the assumption is when we ask these questions. So as an educator, what am I assuming about my students, and how do I get them to actually think about those tough questions? For example, when you think about, how does this line up with my own personal values? What assumption are we making about those values, particularly in an environment that's very diverse? Culturally, where are we pulling from to kind of get people to think about those things and line them up with their own values, having been, kind of brought up a certain way, where the assumption on my part is that you have, sort of these institutions that have instilled these values and these morals. And so how do we get them to, I guess, align, and how do we come to a shared understanding on these things?
That's a terrific question. I think as I think about when I ask these questions of myself and when I ask these questions of others, I think it's important to not say that my my values must be the same as my friends or my colleagues, but I think as you look at the institutions you work for, the projects you work on, the things you may be asked to do in those, do they line up for you as an individual, which may be different than someone else? And how do you help people understand that they maybe not have, I mean, obligation is probably a strong word. We're careful about saying when people have obligations, but that it's encouraged, and that they do think about the consequences or values behind it. Like, what are the values behind it? Like, when you think about this, what do you as an individual think about? And I think the recent ruling on embryos is a really interesting one. That may resonate very differently depending on your cultural and religious values, and that's okay. But you should be thinking about what it means for you. And I often, when I mentor young people in their careers, and saying, think about what type of institution you want to work for. Think about what the trade-offs might be for depending on that, and how does that line up with your values. And through the FASB work, we do a lot of work with law students and at law firms, or new legal associates. And the questions we ask there is like, by choosing where you go, by choosing the projects you work on, you can and should feel empowered to say, how does this line up with my own personal values? And help them understand it's not that there's a right or wrong answer generally, but they should be thinking about that. Oh, and I do see we've had a couple of questions come in.
Yeah, so the question following the diverse values, how might these tough questions be best used applied in a multifunctional team that are often part of a new product development and launch?
Andrew, thanks for that question. And I'll use my example of having worked on drug development teams where you have a lot of different people, you have a lot of different global teams. I will say, first of all, it's complex. And I think if I think about going back to my days on drug development, it was, to what extent are what we're talking about, is it universal? To what extent might we need to consider the cultural variations that happen around the world for our end users? And how might we bring in the respective perspectives of the individuals on the team? So I think even just openly having some of these consequences, and it could be more like, okay, everybody, let's use our individual perspectives and think about the potential unintended consequence. You're an electrical engineer, you're a physician, you're a statistician, a biologist, you're the engineer. Using your potential knowledge and expertise, how might we think about these problems? The values are a tricky one, as you note, but I think that's almost more of a personal reflection as you think about raising questions or concerns, or just even thinking about, okay, we want to put this feature into that product. How might that affect people who, and then again, you can leverage differences in experiences. How might that impact people who have lower socioeconomic status, don't have as much resources? So I guess I think of it as both, Andrew, challenging myself personally, but then thinking about what expertise and experience I have that I can bring to that team and help them see that they have that perspective that might be different from somebody else that could be useful.
Great, thank you so much. There's another question here, and it's interesting because this is a question that comes up in my classes sometimes, and I know it becomes a complex question because of the various stakeholders and how each stakeholder plays a role in it. So there is a question about, for example, drug costs, and Eliquis is the example that cost over $7,100 in the US versus $900. What's the ethical dilemma and why? So can we, to the extent that we can have this discussion, I think should have its own webinar, but to the extent that we can address it now, what are your thoughts on this?
Since the person asking the question mentioned two discrete jurisdictions, maybe I'll start there, because this is a common question that comes up as we think about the role of sovereign nations in deciding what is acceptable for their citizens. And We can lament that in the US, we have no universal health care, we have inconsistent health insurance, and we have a system that allows a medicine to be priced at $7,100 a year. So what often comes up for me in these types of questions is, how do we think about, and especially this almost even goes back to Andrew's question, the challenges of thinking about global development. How do you navigate the differences in a country like Canada versus the US? How do you think about the implications of those? I'm probably going to dodge your question a little bit on the ethical dilemma, but I think there is a core ethical dilemma in how we think about healthcare as a right, who we choose gets to benefit, and this is broader than the pharma industry, I'd say. So there's, as Azita mentioned, I think one thing that is often not considered is the complexity of the environment in which these things happen. And I think it'll be interesting to see how some of the new pricing negotiations in the US help to start shaping this. And that'll be a really interesting exercise to see if that helps shift the US perspective. But it's fascinating to me to see the differences around the world as certain jurisdictions. And this was really interesting in the COVID pandemic as well, of when we saw a lot of the developed countries sort of snap up the contracts and gain access. So I think we've got a real fundamental ethical dilemma as we think about equity of access around the world and how that ties into the systems in those countries, what the countries are willing to pay for, and how do you navigate in that space in a way that is credible. So I apologize if that's a little bit of a punt, but I do think there is a dilemma that is rooted in ethics in these questions around pricing, accessibility, globalization, and how to make sense of it. So why is that? That's a fascinating question. I'm probably not equipped to answer the why. You might even be more well positioned to answer that. It's been interesting though. I mean, if you look at the different motivations of different countries, it's really interesting. But I'm probably not well equipped to answer the why.
Great.
Thank you for asking that.
Yeah, that was a great question. And like I said, I think we need to have a webinar just for the ethics of drug pricing. I do think that there is space for that kind of question.
I would encourage you to have a webinar on the complexity of the cost of delivery of healthcare and how pricing happens in that.
Yeah. So for the anonymous attendee, you just gave me an idea. So thank you so much for that. I don't see any other questions. And I know you said you had a case that you wanted us to take a look at. You have another question.
I think Cameron just popped one in here. So
okay.
Let's see. More from the J&J side, I wonder about the true purpose question you asked. Certain drugs are cash cows for pharma because they treat chronic disease, but essential medicines not being developed. How does a leader like J&J and its spheres of influence make sure that the drugs that must be developed are done versus these new drugs like statins? That's a great question, Cameron. And I'll answer this carefully to make sure I'm not overstepping in what I say, or because there are some things about some decisions that I'm just not going to be able to give you insights into. But this is a common refrain of then how do we prioritize and how do we find the models and the space to develop the products that aren't going to generate the revenue that will ever recoup the R&D costs necessary to develop them. So how do you create incentives in the system so that things like the antibiotics or treatments for malaria or treatments for TB and other things that aren't going to be as profitable are developed? From a J&J perspective, we've had a separate group called Global Public Health that's done a lot of development in infectious diseases, HIV, tuberculosis, dengue fever. So some of the models in industry that sort of cordon off that type of research and don't hold it subject to the same type of expectations as chronic conditions that may be necessary, and we can maybe even debate about decisions around necessary versus Me Too and things like that. So that is one model where I think some larger institutions have gone to be able to put back into the system the resources to develop those things. Donation of products is another way. Merck the company that I used to work for, it's public, of donation of river blindness medicine. J&J has donated medicines for tuberculosis. So it's interesting though, but it is a really challenging question that I've seen best solved through multi-stakeholder type engagement, where you get the local actually impacted countries, regions, participants, and how they can partner with industry to leverage the size for good and figure out how to use the size for good, even if that's not going to be the focus of the main pipeline. So I hope that helps, but that's sort of the perspective on that. And I would argue that I think the leaders in industry do have a role to play in advancing that and staying committed to that, because otherwise I'm not sure where it would happen. We have 4 minutes, Azita. Maybe I'll give you all an example. I'll go back a slide. And this just is a little bit of maybe thinking about, this is a personal story too. So, but it's a case that kind of covers concepts around innovation, and maybe it's a good one to kind of close as a thought exercise. So just imagine that you're preparing for a clinical trial. There's a potential new approach for treating head and neck cancer. And you've got a really well-known surgeon at a large medical center, and they are eager to find patients to enroll in this trial. The current standard of care, treat aggressively with radiation and chemo. We know those things work, but we also know that patients who've had that may not be good candidates for another round. So this is almost an example of where we have a lot of data on something that works, and we have things that work, but maybe they don't work for everyone, and maybe we do want to improve. So let's say the surgeon's interested in studying, there's this innovative, very intensive flap type surgery where they take a piece of skin from underneath your arm, they resect part of the mandible that's affected by the cancer, and then they do a really high dose of radiation during the operation, and then follow it by chemotherapy to see if that's going to help. So actually removing the tumor, doing this complicated surgery, will that be better? Patients who've reached that usually have gone through extensive, diminishment of quality of life, and it's not clear if this is actually going to improve the quality of life. And in this particular situation, I think the thought exercise that's interesting is to think about, and this goes to the question about how do you think about the questions that I was asking you in the context of a team situation. So imagine this surgeon really wants to find people to do this surgery, really, really wants to try it out, believes in it, and is going to be an advocate for doing the surgery. And yet, how do you make sure that the information provided to patients will help them understand what the actual implications of this surgery are? How do you make sure that you don't minimize the fact that you're going to have this big, bulky flap of skin on your face that's not going to basically, ever go away? How do you help them understand that the uncertainty in this new treatment versus the certainty of what we know? And this was a really interesting, in particular, with this particular family member, really being persuaded by the power of this surgeon who presented it in a very compelling, positive way. And the majority of my time was spent helping her think through and understand, what are the downsides? What if this doesn't work? How are you going to feel about this? And if you didn't do anything, what would that be like? And so I just share this as another cautionary tale, or another, as it comes up more in bioethics and engagement with patients and talking about really novel, exciting technology. How do we continue to challenge ourselves to think about what the consequences are and what patients may not be thinking about, or helping them identify from their perspective what might be the best option for them. So I'll leave that with you as a thought experiment. I will just say, Azita, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for the folks who asked questions. They were terrific. And if you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn or chat sometime or talk about the pharmaceutical industry, happy to.
Thank you so much, Carla. This was an awesome 1 hour that we spent. I learned a great deal. And I want to thank the OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Burns, and our coordinator, Tracy Marshalls, whose picture that you see, but she's making sure that everything runs smoothly on this platform. And to all of you for joining us. So thanks a lot. Enjoy the weekend, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.